One second. All right, greetings everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the doctoral defense of Thomas Hale. Thomas joined us just a little less than 4 years ago as a PhD student from George Washington University, where he was at the Evans School of Public Policy doing his master's. And prior to that, he did his bachelor's from Virginia Tech. He has a distinguished career also working with government organizations and advisory capacities with DoD, with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also in the nonprofit and think tank domain, and is a minerals collector himself and a minerals educator. He also runs a nonprofit focused on minerals education. And so we've been really delighted to have him in our community in the department. And so now he's going to share with us his doctoral findings. He's been supported by a National Science Foundation navigating the new Arctic grant, and has spent field seasons in Greenland. So you'll hear more about that. Special thanks to the committee, to Dr. Julie Klinger, who is now at University of Wisconsin, but also happily still affiliated with us at UD, Dr. Rebecca Nixon, who is at University of Washington in Seattle, but also happily still associated with UD, and Dr. Adam Bobette from University of Glasgow in the UK, for advising Tom on a very eclectic, methodologically rich dissertation. So the plan is we'll have 45-minute presentation from Tom. Then we will have questions from the public. They're the participants, non-committee members. And then, we have, it's a mixed tradition. Sometimes we let the audience stay, and there's some questions from the committee that they can hear just for the benefit of the students. But I think for the sake of time, we will just move then directly to the private part of the defense, where we'll ask the public to adjourn, and then we'll have about an hour or so with Tom with questions, and then wrap up, hopefully. So that's the plan. Any questions, comments? All right. Thank you. Tom, please take it away.
All right, can everyone see this? Just want to verify. All right, perfect. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I think we said that we're tuning in from a lot of different time zones. I'm really excited to be presenting my work and my dissertation, which really has not just been an academic journey for me, but also a personal journey coming from the field of geosciences and wanting to ask questions around how geologic knowledge is produced, but also the relationship between geology, society, and policy. I did not plan for it, but I don't know if people are aware, today is Earth Day. And so I think it's very fitting for us to have this conversation. So I just wanted to say happy Earth Day to everybody, because I think it is very connective to what we're going to talk about in this presentation. Now, my dissertation is titled Geology as Geopolitics, Mineral Diplomacy, Earth Science, and Extractive Governance in Greenland. I thought what I would do first is kind of look at the so what, or kind of what we're talking about here, and put this dissertation into context. I will be honest, I think I have a little bit of an advantage that because not always does our research have these international news and is all in the news all the time, but I think over the last 2 years, and especially the last 6 months, there's been a lot of conversations about Greenland and Denmark and the United States, a lot of very concerning rhetoric. But I also think that there has been this increasing recognition that Greenland is an emerging player in Arctic geopolitics, and that the role of Greenland that is going to play in these discussions are going to become more important over time. This is important in the context of this research because discussions and ideas about independence, sovereignty, and security at the surface are becoming increasingly intertwined with these subsurface narratives and these resources and reserves underneath the Greenland ice sheet and along the edges of Greenland. And I think that having this conversation today and being able to discuss the relationship between the surface and the subsurface and the political nature between the two is really important. As I said, there have been a lot of aggressive comments by the United States over the last 6 months and even in the last 2 years, which I think is highlighting this increasing neocolonial reality of extractive politics. I think for many social scientists in the room, this would not be a surprise. I think that's probably what extractive politics has been, and it has been part of empire for a very long time. But I see a concerning trend here, and having these discussions and unpacking these relationships are very important. And one of the things that have been an interesting finding for me, and I think is very relevant to this discussion, is that even though Greenlanders do have control over their mineral policy, they still don't really have control over their foreign policy decisions or international affairs. And this is interesting because we see a lot of mineral diplomacy and mineral deals have some sort of relationship to defense or national security dynamics. And I think in the case of Greenland, can you really have a full say over your subsurface if you are not able to say where those materials go out into the world? And so when we think about extractive politics, it's not just about how you mine and how mining is done with local communities, but is also where are those materials going in the world? Are they going to weapons? Are they being used in war? These things matter a lot to communities, and it is very important that we unpack that in the context of extractive politics. Now, what I want to do is give an overview of how this presentation is going to go. So we talked about the so what, and then I'm going to go look into the guiding research question of this thesis. We're going to look at a couple different theoretical lenses. I have a lot of different theories in this paper, but I wanted to highlight some foundational ones that I think is important for us to be on the same page about. This basically is analytical interventions of knowledge production, spatial politics, and temporal politics. Those are the lens of analysis. This is a 3-paper model dissertation, so we're going to go through each individual paper, starting at the local level, the multinational, and the global. We're going to look at Iviktut as a mine site at the local level with planning, cryolite as a material and the diplomacy, and go zoom out into big picture for the Gadar province at a global level. And of course, all of these papers are in communication with one another, but at the same time, the first paper reflects these initial findings and questions, and each paper after that is going to try to build upon the previous one. And then we're going to go do the findings of the 3 papers and address the research question. And then we'll finish off with study limitations, future directions, and the conclusion, which is 4 bullet points for 4 years of a lot of work. As a lot of geographers are in the room, I think it's important that we situate ourselves in the world. So we're looking at the very tip of Greenland in the southwest region. This is the Gadar Igneous Province that I'll be talking about mostly today. This is a very famous alkaline igneous deposit in Greenland. A lot of petrology, economic geology courses talk about the Gadar Province. The 2 case studies that I'm going to focus on today specifically, though, within the Gadar province are Iviktut, this historic cryolite mine, and the Illimasuk intrusive complex. Both of these sites are highly politicized over their subsurface resources, both in the Danish and Greenlandic relation with the colonial history of Iviktut, but also this Illimasuk deposit, which has an ongoing legal case we'll talk about, as well as the U.S. interest in rare earths in Greenland often stems back to the Illimasuk deposit. And what I think is really interesting as a geologist, but also working in geography, is that despite these deposits forming over 1 billion years ago, their geochemistry and their exploration histories continue to shape geopolitical narratives today and the way that these foreign engagements take place, but also how futures are made in Greenland. And so there's this really interesting connection between deep geologic time, the present, and the future that I think is really interesting to try to unpack. Now, my guiding research question is, what role or roles do subsurface geologies and materialities of the Gadar province play in influencing and altering surface geopolitics and human environmental relationships in southwest Greenland? The hypothesis, which is derived from my past in geosciences, is that yes, the structural, geochemical, and material properties of the Gadar province are directly involved in shaping extractive possibilities, geopolitical dynamics, and human environmental relationships in southwest Greenland. So through this presentation, we're going to go and try to address and answer those questions. But I also wanted, because in part of my dissertation, I do have an entire chapter on kind of the theory around a lot of the logics of the research. And I wanted to just highlight these 5 core theoretical foundations that have really inspired me, but also driven me to do the work that I'm doing. And I think it is also important to just reflect that this is a journey from the natural science toward a more critical engagement with how knowledge, power, and the subsurface are co-produced. I'm very lucky to have Adam Babette here today of political geology, and I have to say that reading Adam's work is what was the catalyst to asking these questions. I think as a geologist, I found it very exciting. And so Adam in the field of political geology is really the interdisciplinary field that is focused on studying the relationship between geological processes, materials, and politics. We also have subsurface politics, which is also really important with Mark Nuttall, Bruce Braun in the Greenlandic context, which is framing and reimagining of space as an influence of geological subsurface politics, which can organize these state activities at the surface. Gavin Bridge also produces something that I think is really interesting here, this idea of natural versus social production, which is how material is transformed from these natural geological forces through social ideals into things like electric vehicles and all the politics that happen in between. And I think what's really important here to note is that there's this middle world between the natural and the social, or the subsurface and the surface, that is a process of abstraction, which is often westernized science, which makes the world and the subsurface knowable, governable, and in many cases extractable. And then as a geologist, I was always looking at road cuts, trying to piece back together kind of the geologic history and the three dimensionality of these spaces. And so I was really excited to learn about volumetric and vertical geopolitics, which really recognize that, okay, geopolitics is not just about area and territories, these kind of two-dimensional maps, as it may have been back in the colonial periods, but it is also about the volume. And so securing the volume is a recognition that things like the maritime water, the airspace, space, the subsurface are all these important volumes that are part of a state's interest and their geopolitical outcomes. And then lastly, chronopolitics. When I think about space as a geologist, I also think about time. And I wanted to try to pull in this idea of the politics of time. So George Wallace and Ian Klink do a really interesting job here talking about the role and the politics of time on influence not only temporal realities, which shape narratives, but also shape spaces. And so I look at time as not a parameter of extractive politics, but rather a core lens of analysis. Time is not just the past, the present, and the future, but it is part of our spatial relationships. And I really love this quote from Adam and Amy in their book, which is the premise of this political geology is to create a productive generative symmetry between geology and politics that can be understood both as the politics of geology and the geology of politics. And I don't know, that geology of politics really got me. I thought that was just a very fascinating concept to catalyze this work. And so before we get into the papers, I do want to kind of give a little bit design of the project overall and some of its methods. I was able to spend 75 days doing field work in Greenland. I was very fortunate enough to be kind of a geological tour guide and a guest scientist on a Norwegian science expedition. I've been in Greenland multiple summers now, able to visit many communities along the west coast, as you can see on the image here on the right. And I was also able to do 10 days in Denmark doing archival work and interviews with many Greenland and Danish colleagues at the university, as well as the museum and National Archives. I've interviewed about 15 stakeholder groups in total across from civil society, local communities, industry groups, and the Danish Arctic Command. We also did a 1.5-day participatory mapping workshop, which is part of that first paper that we're going to talk about, along with follow-ups and continuous communications to refine some of these maps and the research. And then the methods here I really look at is kind of a mixed methods approach. It includes archival research, participatory mapping, stakeholder interviews, and what I'm trying to think about as an interpretive political geology analysis, taking geochemistry, petrology, geological maps, and trying to translate that into social political analysis. So it's a melding between geology, social sciences, and political science. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these papers, discuss their focus, their methods, and their findings. So paper number 1 is called Mapping Arctic Futures, Harnessing Participatory Tools for Sustainable Development in Inuktitut, Greenland. This paper is already published in the Journal of Society and Natural Resources. The focus here is that it examines the post-industrial futures at the former Inuktitut mine. The research questions are, how do communities and stakeholders negotiate redevelopment, restoration, and new land uses? And what roles can participatory mapping play in this process? This is also when I first joined on the PhD, was part of the STAR project overall. Of course, this is a methods-focused paper where we look at participatory mapping, stakeholder interviews, archival research, to also try to identify competing visions and possible coexistence between land use activities at Inuktitut and the Arsuk Fjord. I just want to note here too that's really interesting is that when we started this project, all the different case studies from multiple Arctic countries were either mine sites that were in the process of closing down or had already been shut down. But I think what's really interesting is pretty much every case study that we looked at was either planning to be redeveloped or redefined for a new site of extraction because of all the critical mineral discussions that are happening in the world today. So it's interesting to see how the subsurface continually gets redefined, and that is something that we initially saw at the beginning of this project. I wanted to just show an image here because I think it is really a good way to look at what the mine looked like back when it was in full operation. It's a very unusual mine for those that maybe are familiar with looking at mine sites. It's right next to the water in this deep water fjord. This is the cryolite mineral down here at the lower left. And what I wanted to say is you probably ask, well, why cryolite, why Greenland, and why Iviktut? Well, cryolite was really important because it was an intermediary material that took the melting point to get alumina out of bauxite, which is the primary ore of aluminum, from around 2000 degrees Celsius to around 900 to 1000. So it cut the energy demand in half. And so what we're looking at here is a material that was not a primary ore, but it was a material that made aluminum a ubiquitous metal in our society. So this process and the use of cryolite made that material a metal that we use in our everyday life. If it wasn't for cryolite and it wasn't for the Hale process, that metal would probably still be very, very expensive. Also, unlike many critical mineral deposits that we talk about in today's world, this was the only source of cryolite economically in the world. There's never been another large-scale economic site for cryolite. And in just 150 years, despite forming over 1 billion years ago, this entire deposit was completely mined out. Because demand for aluminum became so high at the same time the mining was occurring, eventually a synthetic version was created. And what this means is that there's no direct connection to the site of extraction in the sense of a physical material coming out of the mine, even though cryolite as a synthetic industrial inspiration is still transforming the aluminum industry today. I also wanted to show some of the outcomes from our mapping project, which we tried to identify various zones of interest. You can see all sorts of different activities here, from remediation, muskox hunting, the license zone, a very interesting eco research project, which are these unique geological formations that we're going to talk more about, military activity, tourism, archaeology, and of course, fishing. What I wanted to show here, what I think is really interesting, is that when you look at all these drawings from the stakeholders, the one that stands out to me is the mining license. While other land use activities and actors kind of follow the contours of the land, the mining license has these strict 90-degree angles because they can only look at what is within the permit that has been approved for the mining company. So you can already see that there's a different relationship to land between the different stakeholders and the kind of parameters that are set forth by the mining license. And I just think that is a really interesting perspective, and we're going to talk more about how that actually changed through the work that we did. So we identified 5 different pathways at Iviktut. The first was redevelopment of the Iviktut mine, so this is like an extractive future. Then the second was environmental remediation, so cleaning up the site. The third was maintaining traditional livelihoods, kind of a status quo with hunting and fishing being a big focus for the fjord. We also had geotourism and geoheritage efforts. This was looking at preserving Iviktut as a site for education as well as tourism in the local area. You can actually see the buildings here on the top right are really dilapidated and many of them are crumbling. And so there's been a lot of efforts and discussion on maybe trying to preserve some of this history or at least find a way to promote geotourism in the region. And then the last is the protection of these Ika columns and the adjoining Ika fjord. And this is an interesting one because prior to our work, no other research had actually incorporated the Ika fjord, since it's an adjoining fjord, into Iviktut's kind of development analysis. I think part of this is because at the surface, they are completely disconnected, but at the subsurface, the geologies are interconnected, and the hydrology from these deposits near Iviktut are directly correlated to performing and producing these Ika columns in the other fjord. So at the surface, it doesn't look connected, but at the subsurface, it does. And that's a unique kind of geological, geographic lens there. Now, each of these pathways, of course, present obstacles and potential concerns, but what we thought was really interesting is that at this point, the mine had never really communicated with any of the stakeholders of how tourism would still operate if the mine opened up. They did not communicate with the communities on how muskox hunting would occur if the mine was developed. And so when we had this participatory mapping workshop and stakeholder discussion, we were shocked to see that there had been no other conversations. Now, this is maybe not shocking because it's an exploration company and they had not received the exploitation license. So some company officials said that was not their priority, but I'm sure many of us in this room would agree that early consultation and having these discussions can prevent conflict and reduce tensions between stakeholders. It's also interesting here that the company, even though they're purchasing the Iviktut license and positioning it as, well, we're going to redevelop this area, look at the quartz at the bottom of the pit and use that to make some money, clean up the tailings, their main focus is a carbonatite that's on the same license that has rare earth elements in it. And at a time where all these discussions about Greenland and rare earths are being had, this company is kind of laid low under the radar because they're able to kind of position the site as an Iviktut mine rather than a rare earth mining site. And so they're able to kind of get away from all these other rare earth narratives that are in Greenland by positioning it as just, well, it's the historic cryolite mine. Now, our key findings are one, that Iviktut remains a contested and politically active landscape. I think that there was this assumption when I started the research this would have been an abandoned site, but I don't really think there's anything as such as an abandoned mining site. There are so many histories and futures and pasts all interconnected in this space that it is continually active long after extraction takes place. I also want to just have a special acknowledgement to Peter Barfoot here, who is a former Iviktut resident and grew up there as a boy. There's been many long nights staying with Peter at his home, going through maps, going through old photos and pictures and geological reports, working together to really unpack this story. He is known in Greenland and Nuuk as the Iviktut historian, and so it's been a real honor to carry on some of that legacy working with him. Now, we also worked with another author, Christian Fleming, who really, together, we actually looked at how a lot of the knowledge production in Southwest Greenland's mineral resources was actually connected to the mine site's investment and profits of the cryolite mine, which means that all these other extractive sites that are potentially going to be developed in Southwest Greenland in the future, their original geological assessments, reports, and mapping can be connected back to the financing from Iviktut. So the geological knowledge produced in Southwest is actually connected to the Iviktut mine. And participatory mapping can actually support conflict anticipation, transparency, and negotiation. And I think the biggest finding, and I think sometimes in our research, you want to have these kind of so what's and a direct outcome to your work that you do within just months of it happening. And it is not always the case. But we were actually able to uncover an error in the licensing process where, even though the license was granted in 2007, there had been the license over top of the military base, and no one had actually noticed this until our participatory mapping took place. And this is what happened. Before the license was there, you could see that this entire military base was covered by the license. And after our mapping, when the Danish Arctic Command found out, within just 3 months of our mapping project, a giant chunk of the mining license was taken away from the company. This is important because the road system that they were going to use that connects the military base to the mine site goes through that section. And so now the only way to get to it would be going further up in the fjord, which the company had not planned for it, or guess what? In the Ika Fjord, which has these unique geological columns and is very shallow, so boats cannot enter. And so this has really challenged the mining company's logistical plan, but also it reflects the fact that without the participatory mapping, this conflict would not have been found, and there could have been a lot of issues and legal challenges with the mining company and the military base. And I just wanted to show you a picture of these wonderful columns because I think it is really interesting to look at Greenland in a very different way from the cold fjords, and to look at these unique columns that, when we were doing this research, we worked with the research team of the ICA project, and they actually produced a paper during our time which showcased that the hydrology of the carbonatite, and it actually precipitates out these unique geological columns that percolate up to the surface and form these stalagmites at the bottom of the fjord. And you can see they get very almost at the top of the water. And so again, without our research, there had been no other papers that had actually included it. And so we've worked very closely with the ICA research team to make sure that any planning that happens at Iviktut also includes the Ika Fjord, because geologically they are connected. So now I want to move to paper 2, which really takes it from a local level to more of a kind of a national to international or multinational perspective, with mineral diplomacy in Greenland, learning from U.S.-European history of engagement at the Iviktut cryolite mine. This has also already been published in Frontiers in Political Science. The focus here really is looking and investigating the geopolitical and diplomatic history and their relationship at Iviktut, centering on the materiality of cryolite. The research question is, in what ways did the material properties and strategic value of cryolite at Iviktut influence diplomacy, state interests, and broader geopolitical relations in Greenland. And the methodology here is archival work, stakeholder interviews, and using a lot of the data and the findings, which were like, okay, there's something going on here, and the participatory mapping work that we did previously. The picture on the right here is showing you supply chains of cryolite throughout the war. And when Denmark was invaded by the Nazis in World War II, all of the material that was coming out of Greenland actually was coming to Philadelphia. So there's this kind of unique Delaware, Philadelphia connection there from all that material that came through to the US during the war because the entire supply chain to Denmark was cut out because of the war. Now, the key findings and outcomes of this paper was first, there's so much discussion in the news about mineral diplomacy. You hear a lot of think tanks talking about it. You hear a lot of government agencies talking about it, but there's actually no academic literature that tries to define and create a base in which it can be interrogated and improved upon. So we wanted to define mineral diplomacy as it is. So this is not like a what it should be, but it is a political process which recognizes the explicit and implicit role minerals and materials play and influencing geopolitical activities, shaping diplomatic narratives, and creating specific economic and national security conditions, which then define political engagement between two or more actors. So it's a diplomacy based upon the materiality and the use of those materials in our society. Now, cryolite here was a diplomatic agent. It was far from neutral, but what it did is it transformed international relationships and Greenland's position in the world. At a time where many communities in Greenland were disconnected from the world due to the colonization of the country, Iviktut was its own place of exception. A lot of the technologies that were used in Greenland were first tested out at Iviktut. There used to be all sorts of international delegations coming to Iviktut, meaning so it was actually a European conclave set up within the broader country of Greenland. What's really interesting here too is the fact that it wasn't until the mid early 2000s that Iviktut lost its municipal status and is now part of the larger capital municipality, Somersuk. And so for a very, very long time, it was given its own municipality to kind of disconnect it from the broader Greenlandic context. And then I think it's really important here to look at the fact that extractive sites can reshape sovereignty, security, and community futures. All this discussion about the United States' interest in Greenland today and these security agreements, when World War II happened, as I said, the supply for cryolite was basically shut down. And so the United States took over Greenland for the security dynamics and basically had a lot of soldiers stationed at the Iviktut area and this in the space that you're looking at here, which is the Grønnedal military base. About 300 to 400 troops were staffed there during the war. And what's really interesting is that we produced around 300,000 aircraft during World War II that was directly connected to the access of the cryolite that we could actually produce it at a lower energy cost. So it was a strategic advantage to have the supply chain. And when you look at these security agreements that have taken place around 1951 and after that, it really traces back to Iviktut and the supply chain of cryolite. So while, yes, we talk about maritime security today, yes, you can look at the Cold War, the United States' interest in Greenland and the connectivity, while you can go back to Abraham Lincoln, a lot of this does connect back to World War II and the security of cryolite, which at the time was completely shut down. You could not have any communications out of the area because it was a military strategic site. So this would have been a critical mineral if we had critical minerals as they're designated today back during World War II. Now, what's really interesting is that throughout this research, a lot of things were happening. Again, this is seemed to be an abandoned mine site, but there were so many discussions that were taking place, out research, and things around this kind of site in Greenland. And so in 2025, a documentary released, we knew this was coming through working with Peter and others, released. And the documentary released called Greenland's White Gold, and it wanted to highlight the colonial legacy of the mine. Within 6 days, it was taken off the Danish media because of a controversial statement around how much money was actually made, not just from the profits and the revenues, but how much money was taken away from the Greenlandic people and then put to support the Danes. And of course, because of the colonial issues and the sensitivity of this conversation, it was taken off the air, and right now it can only be viewed with many activist groups or if the directors and the team actually come and show it. What this showcased, though, and what our work was actually showcasing at the same time, is that there are power asymmetries throughout the mine's life cycle, which continue to play out today and shape Danish-Greenlandic relations. Even though cryolite is not physically in that supply chain anymore, right? It's a natural material. it is creating these power asymmetries and these unequal advantages for certain people because of the colonial extractive past that took place here back many years ago. If any of you have seen these Royal Danish cookies or maybe Kim's chips in Denmark, I think the Royal Danish cookies are more popularized in America. Um, Maybe your grandmother puts their sewing kit and needles in it. I know mine did. These basically, we actually can trace back the flow and the financial success of many of these companies to the Iviktut cryolite mine. So many of these companies were able to use the colonial nature of the mine site, the extractive history of the mine site, to then become at an advantage over many Greenlandic communities. And then those companies become successful, and now they're household names today. And so this shows you the unequalness between many of these venture capitalists that were investing in Iviktut at the time. And of course, many Greenlanders were not allowed to either work there or invest in it. And now these companies that we see today that are a big part of our culture have direct connection back to the colonial legacy of the Iviktut cryolite mine. So it is really interesting. And many of the activists call this hashtag cryolite cookies, where you try to connect the geology back to these sites of extraction. So again, even though cryolite and the mine are closed, it is still playing out in the media and the commentary of the Danish Greenlandic people today and the US Danish Greenland security dynamics. And so the last paper we're going to talk about is really wrapping it together and looking at the broader Gadar Igneous province. So this is subsurface, instead of subsurface politics, I'm calling it subsurface geopolitics in Southwest Greenland's Gadar Igneous province. We have not published this paper yet, but we're planning to either look for Exis or Geoform or some other venues. The focus here is that we wanted to take the first two papers that we say, okay, something is happening here with these materials. They're transcending space and time in the sense that some of these past, presents, or futures are all being intertangled right here in the current moment that we're all living. In the case of Arsuk, the past for a mining company is someone else's present. They're still living in the outcomes of those colonial histories. And so this investigates the broader province, looking at the role of geochemistry, so the makeup of the minerals and the materials, the petrology, the makeup of the rocks, and the structural geology in geopolitics. The research question that I ask here is, how do the geologies and the materialities of Gadar shape extractive geopolitics across space and time? And the methodology here is a case study analysis between Iviktut and the Illimalsuk intrusive complex, which again we'll talk about, is broken down into two sections. What you see on the right here is the community of Nasak, one of my favorite places in Greenland, and right behind that large mountain is the Illimalsuk deposit, where this mining is potentially going to take place. Now, we've talked a lot about Iviktut, so for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus here on the Illimalsuk intrusive complex and look at the geopolitics of this site. But of course, in the paper, we also go through the Iviktut site as well. Now, what I think is really fascinating here is that the Illimalsuk complex is a singular igneous intrusive complex, yet glacial forces have carved it into two different geopolitical stages. So geological forces create it, and geological forces carve it in half. And as you can see here, it's carved in half by the Tunaliarvik Fjord. Now, with many of these types of deposits, they're not always equal, and all the mineral zones and the geochemistry and petrology of the site. So you can actually see that it's a very different from the lower part of the Illimalsuk to the upper part. And that has created, again, two different geopolitical stages. The first I want to talk about is the Kringlerna, which has also been called the Tambri site, which is the lower part of the IIC. And this is really centering politics around U.S. intervention. This is the site that the U.S. government wants to maybe invest around $120 million in, as well as foreign investments and some issues that have been noted around corruption in the South, including the challenges of eudialyte. So unlike cryolite, which was an accelerator for industrial processes, the main rare earth mineral here is eudialyte. The challenge of this is the fact that when you try to get rare earths from eudialyte, there's a lot of silica gel that is produced. And that means that the economic advantage of eudialyte is not really there in the current market. Therefore, it's really not an economically viable deposit unless you subsidize it, you have a lot of strategic interest in it. And so it's really challenged this, but at the same time, the narratives of the subsurface and the need to acquire rare earth elements from the United States are superseding the subsurface geologies that make it really difficult to extract. And it's a really kind of a low percentage ore grade, even though there's a lot of it. It is not necessarily a high grade deposit. The upper IIC, which again is behind the community of Nasak, is the Kvanfjeld. And this is really interesting because this centers politics around the uranium ban and ongoing legal case against the government. What happened here is basically there had been some mining for uranium back in the 50s and 60s, and eventually in the mid 2000s, there was a uranium ban or moratorium that took place. The company had already bought up the property, started doing some mapping, doing some drilling, but when the ban took place, any deposit that had over 100 parts per million of uranium could now no longer be extractable under Greenlandic law. And this caused the company to then sue the Greenland government for 11 billion USD, which is 3 times the GDP of the country. And so this created a very tenuous political environment where the uranium ban created a very different geopolitics. And so, again, right across the fjord, the way that the geochemistry, petrology, and the mineralogy of the deposit is set up, the Kringlerne has lower than 100 ppm. So it can be extracted because it's not, but the upper part cannot because it is over 100 ppm. So again, it is interesting how these geological forces have carved out two different geopolitical realities. Now, I look at Illimasik as a site of future potential caught up in subsurface geopolitics. There's so many narratives and conversations about the subsurface that are trying to negate some of the more technical metallurgy that is a challenge to actually extract it. So there's always this conversation about what could be versus what actually is with many of these deposits and whether or not they would be economically viable in their extraction. I also think it's important to note here that while all of this is kind of in limbo, we have to recognize that many of the communities are also unsure of what their future holds because there's this constant looming, is there going to be a mine or not in the future? They are concerned about dust from the mine that may have radioactive elements in it, whether or not this is a real concern that has been a challenge for many sheep herders because Narsaq produces about 30,000 sheep a year, all of that going to the Greenlandic economy. And so basically, you have a future that is stalled for many of the local stakeholders and a future that is in limbo for these mining companies. And so there's this really big contention in time and space in these extractive sites between the different stakeholders. They do not all see the place the same way at the same time. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting too is that there had never been a discussion really in any of the analysis that I looked like. You hear people talk about tuctopite as a mineral that is found in the deposit, but this is also Greenland's national mineral. It is very important to the artisanal mining community as well as tourism in the region. A lot of people cab and polish these stones and sell it to tourists. But there has been no discussion with the mining company, which is the one that's suing the government. There's really not much tuctopite in the lower part of the deposit. But there's been no discussion of how, when the mine opens, will the Greenlanders still be able to have access to their national mineral? And I think it's fascinating that that hasn't really been included in the geopolitical analysis of like, wait a minute, there's a national mineral here that has a lot of meaning to a lot of different people. And why is this not included in any sort of consultation or stakeholder engagement? Because it really is important to the people of Narsaq. I wanted to show you what these materials look like because, again, like as I showed you cryolite, I think it's important as a geologist and as someone who loves minerals that we actually know what we're talking about here. It's not just this idea of rare earth elements, but we actually can see the materials. So tuctopite is on the left here. It's actually tenebrescent, which is really interesting. So when it's out in the sunlight, it gets darker, which makes it a very popular jewelry stone. We also are looking at copper-takite, which is the main ore material for eudolite. As you can see, these little red dots. So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at the ore in the Illimasik deposit. And then a lot of the land around Greenland and in the Narsaq community has all these fluorescents. And so a lot of the people in Greenland really love looking at these fluorescent minerals. And you can walk around town with a fluorescent light and you can actually see all these different fluorescent minerals from this site. So it's a really interesting geologically, mineralogically rich site. But unfortunately, that connectivity back to the people, which the people say for jewelry and all these other things, are not included in these discussions, which I think is really interesting. And so the key findings and outcomes here are that materials have political life beyond extraction and their physical manifestations in the supply chain. These properties can shape pace and possibility. Cryolite was an accelerator. It sped up these industrial processes and made aluminum a ubiquitous material within our society. While eudolite slowed down these industrial policies or processes, created a lot of legal battles and making it difficult for extraction. You could argue, why is this research important to do? Because if you would have known the kind of geochemistry petrology and known that it was over 100 parts per million and there was a lot of geopolitical issues around uranium, then maybe the mining company would have been very careful before they made a lot of investments into the site, knowing that these complex geologies could come back to be a political liability later on. So understanding these things as risk, you can actually do that when you understand these subsurface geologies. And so I believe that extraction becomes kind of deterritorialized, both spatially and temporally, where, like in the case of cryolite, this mineral is no longer physically within the supply chain. It is now just an inspiration in the sense that the material that is synthetically produced again, is no longer connected to if it took Greenland, but the power asymmetries and the dynamics between the Greenlanders and the Danes are still real, livable, emotional experiences, even though that site of extraction is no longer producing cryolite. And I think that's just a really interesting thing to recognize of how these materials can be out there in space and time, even though at the original site of extraction, they're no longer there. And so geology, I believe, instead of looking at its static volumes, is a vectoral force where these materials both exert influence but are also influenced upon in their political nature. And so in this paper, I finish it off by trying to make a theoretical contribution around what I call vectoral geopolitics, or really this idea that understands power not through only territory, depth, and volume, which is where we currently are in volumetric geopolitics, but through the directions, pressures, and the temporal trajectories by which those materials, knowledge, capital, and political interests move. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with the GIS layered cake. You can look at these kind of two-dimensional data sets, and then of course you put that into more of a three-dimensional, what's really going on in the world. But what I want to pose is instead of looking at things three-dimensionally, maybe we should look at things in a vectoral field. And so you can imagine this as the site of extraction as these materials flow out into the supply chain and their impact on communities, on capital, on knowledge is moving and pushing in different directions, coming from and stemming from that site of extraction. And so the influences they have and the flows of these materials are changing all the time as they move throughout the supply chain and out into the culture. So this idea focuses mostly on flows rather than volumes, and it tracks how power moves through those materials, knowledge, infrastructure, capital, and governance, and vice versa. And this idea really centers on the idea of chronopolitics, which is that extraction is negotiated through time, pace, and urgency and competing futures. And the question is not just, again, how is extraction going to take place, but whose clock is ruling in that extractive process? Is it the community? Is it the mining company? Is it the state? And you can actually look at things not just spatially, but also temporally combined. And so, again, I think that when we look at geology, materials, knowledge, and power, it is a vector. It is pushing and pulling, and it's changing its magnitude and its direction at various points in time. It's not just a static material or static variable that you can then slice in different times and say, okay, it's important now or it's not important. They're actually moving an ebb and a flow of these materials. And so I think what this does is it links Earth as a geopolitics. It connects subsurface materiality to surface level social, political, and environmental relations. And so now, as we begin to end, I want to focus just on the synthesis of the main findings of the paper. So what this means is extractive politics in Greenland are multiscalar, in which subsurface geologies, these materialities, and these geopolitics interact or exist at multiple levels of space and time. All these papers showcase that the subsurface in geology is not a passive backdrop for geopolitics, but a negotiated human environmental relationship. I'm wanting to give agency back to our planet and be able to have a negotiated conversation, not just a power and a control over nature. Materiality and extraction transcend those spatial dimensions like cryolite, altering spatio-temporal relations between humans and the environment and extractive sites or landscapes. And I think, again, extractive and subsurface politics can be better understood as a vectoral force, where space and time are both co-evolving variables, not just two things that are analyzed separately. And what I'm arguing here is not for, because you may see some of these theories I look at seem like more of an environmental determinism and either or, but I look at geology and geopolitics as a dialectic, a both and, in which there's a conversation equally between those two entities. Now, to address the research question of what are the roles, well, I think that they can accelerate or slow down geopolitical realities in these industrial processes. They can also help determine what kinds of development are materially possible, shaping development debates, land use, and these post-mining futures in the case of Iviktut. They also give places strategic significance beyond the local scale, and again, blurring the line between the extractive space locally and these global economies and systems. And they also shape how people understand and relate to their environment, whether it's a resource frontier, a homeland, a site of industrial legacy and pollution, or a contested political landscape that is both spatial as it is temporal. And so there are three limitations to this study that I do want to highlight because it's important that we recognize that. The first is that this is limited to a regional case study with a very unique specific geology and materiality. And what I kind of argue for in vectoral geopolitics or this analysis is you want to do it a case by case situation, but I would have liked to have had maybe another country or another region included because that would at least given some more ideas to maybe even identify specific vectors that may be identifiable in different cases across similar issues. But if you're going to look at eudialyte, you can't just compare eudialyte in Greenland with maybe the eudialyte and the potential rare earth mining in Sweden, right? They're completely different with different political situations, different geologies, and you have to really be place-based and locally specific. With all the politics that were going on in logistics, I was also unable to do kind of a community field work immersion in Narsak behind that's in front of the Ilimasuk deposit. I really wanted to do that, but I was not able to in the time, and the political situation got very complex in the last 2 years. And I think that vectoral politics, while it is an interesting idea, it needs some more comparative testing, and that's kind of my future plans with this project. So these future ideas, well, first, I think that I believe this fundamentally, that political geology and vectoral geopolitics need to be shared within the geoscience communities to help shape and improve the pedagogy. So many departments are talking about critical minerals. They're talking about the geology, the mineralogy, the petrology, but we recognize that there is a political dimension, a geopolitical dimension to this issue. And so we really need to be able to unpack this as geologists and answer some of these questions that I know I had as a geologist. I know that a lot of students have. So I really want to continue to share this with the geoscience community. I also want to integrate these findings into consultation processes and understand how can a vectoral analysis or even the political geology help support a social or environmental impact assessment? Can we actually have a real world connection to these theories that actually improve the lives at a meaningful level to the local communities? I also, of course, want to do more comparative case studies beyond Greenland. I think it would be interesting to do like lithium in Latin America and all these other materials. And so I think that there is some rich ground to do more work and apply these kind of analytical frameworks to it. And I also believe fundamentally, as someone who's from Appalachia and as someone who's a first gen, I think that we need to always connect theory to policy advocacy and community action. I believe that the ideas that we do here need to matter to people and they need to be contextualized at a community level. And so I really am excited to try to bring this to more communities and find out how can we actually make this meaningful for community action and for advocacy for local communities around these extractive sites. And to conclude, kind of four bullet points here. The subsurface shapes our politics, and the power of politics, both spatially and temporally, reshape the way that we imagine, understand, and interact with that subsurface. We also know that geology is not a backdrop to geopolitics, rather is an active agent in constant negotiation with surface realities. And I want to go back to Julie's question that she asked me in my comp exam because Julie, that has kept me up at night forever. I don't know if I can answer this today. Can a non-extractive geology exist? But I do fundamentally believe that the work Adam is doing, this work, and other scholars, many of those that are in this room, I believe that is a stepping stone to try to find that pathway and at least have an honest conversation. And if I can at least provide that to communities and the geology community, I think that is a step forward. So I don't know if it can, but I do want to fight for that in my future. And so I think that when we look at all these critical mineral studies in Washington, we have to recognize these backgrounds and perspectives of economics and policy that's being made. But I think that if we want to have just and equitable futures, if we want to incorporate indigenous and local knowledge, we have to be able to have these systems and platforms to do that. And so I really do believe that this is a pathway forward for that. And I'm excited to see where that goes. And so I want to just say thank you again to everybody. Want to open it up to some questions. And I wanted to end on this picture at Iviktut because you may not know if you've never been there, but like this is pretty much all these different things combined. You have the muskox laying right behind the mine site. You have this Norwegian house that was actually from the 1800s, given at the World Heritage World Fair. You have a background with a graveyard with from the USS Dorchester that was sunk. You have a seismology a bunker over there. So there's just a lot of things happening in this image, which just goes to show you the lived space that Iviktut is, even though for a lot of people it still is abandoned. And it just shows how these geologies and these materials are transforming our reality far beyond extraction. And with that, I'll end it there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. Right on time. So let's open it up to questions from the general public. There are also chat options if people want to type the questions in. So we have about 10, 12 minutes for public Q&A. All right. Any of our grad students who are studying extractives? I see a few of them are in the mix. Any questions from them? Okay, well, we'll give them a moment to ponder. I wanted to ask you, Tom, then I will go into the committee questions or the public plenary committee questions. We'll do the confidential ones later. It seems we do have time for some plenary ones. One question I'll just quickly pose because you brought it up right at the end to Julie's provocation on whether you can have a non-extractive geology. I think that's a very important provocation. Um, how about, the work about heritage that you just showed some aspects of heritage? There's a whole
Yeah.
field of geoheritage.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that as being a place for that kind of interface?
No, I mean, I think that yes, those are ways to move forward in that discussion. I believe in geoheritage and those ideas like geology education. I do that, right? When I go to Greenland, I'm doing like geoheritage, geotourism and stuff. But I think that what's difficult for me, again, I'm an outsider, I'm a foreigner, I'm not a Greenlander, right? And I think that even though you're doing geoheritage and your geotourism, there is a colonial past and extractive history that you're not going to be able to just eliminate by just calling this space as a geoheritage site, right? And I think that you have to recognize that and be honest about it and open about it. So I do believe those are great pathways forward. I'm really supportive of those fields and those ways of looking at geology. But I think that like Iviktut, like someone says, how would you have a geoheritage site at Iviktut? Well, you could talk about the history and can go through all these things, and I think that's what people wanted to do. But it becomes very sensitive when you want to talk about the colonial nature of Iviktut and the history of communities, because again, it is in the past for a lot of Danes or for a lot of people, but it is the lived reality and future and present for many people in Greenland and also the Arctic community. So you can't really disconnect that. And I think that's why it's really important. And also, I think it's why it's important that if you do geoheritage, that it is local community based and that it is the community that is also doing that and also being involved in that process. I have discussed with the company and with the local community of like trying to create some geological tour guide plans for Iviktut because there's a lot of history. But again, it needs to be led by that community for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. Gabriela has a question from the general audience.
Yes, can you hear me now?
A little bit. Hold on 1 second. Go
Okay,
ahead.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. No, thank you for that. Very interesting your thesis. I have just a small question in your study. Do you oh, maybe the question is how will you measure these competitive forces of the different participants in this environment? You know, all the
Yeah.
stakeholders, the government, international forces. How is that the vectors? You know that you're talking
Yeah.
also. You know, it's a different. There will be a different dimension of each vector, right? So, yeah.
Yes, of course. And I think this goes back to a very poignant question and comment that Adam made when I was going through some reviews of the papers. Like, how do you know these are not arbitrary kind of denotations of specific vectors, and how would you go about measuring them? personally, I looked at that and I said, I think that's out of the scope of this study with the logistics and the time that I had. But I do believe that's the next step for me, is to really go through some more cases, identify some common vectors and different vectors. There may be ones that are specific to a site, and then try to find a way to do that. I think that the way that you measure it is going to be dependent upon whatever the vector is. Like if it is a capital vector, you can look at, my financial flows and investments and things like that. Or if it is an indigenous vector, you can try to look at, resistance and policy and how governance has been allowed or not allowed with indigenous communities. But I get what you're saying. It's a very valid point. I decided to really look and focus on the theory and the idea for what it is, but then for future steps, really focus on how can we measure this? Can we even measure this? Or are these vectors only able to be narrativized? Like, can we only really narratively describe these forces? Or can they actually be? Because I don't want to go in and do something where it's just modeling all the time, because I think it's very disconnected from the real reality to people. I don't want to have some AI model that's measuring vectors. Like, that's a horrible idea that I don't want to go down and see that. But I do think that there is a way that you can narratively describe them to try to show those influences, but I don't know if that there's it's very subjective, and you got to be very careful about that because you don't want to be putting and projecting out certain things that maybe those local communities. So maybe it could be through a participatory process where the communities describe these vectors, but again, you still would have to identify them. And how do you know that in your identification you're not missing something or that it's not just arbitrary? So there needs to be more work on that for sure. But great point, and that is what I've left with for sure.
Yeah, maybe you can in the future do some service to have
Yes.
some valuation, you know, economic valuation of the mining, right? The mining activities. That would be a good way to do that too. Yes, but
And
thank you.
yeah, of course. And I don't want to get to a point where too it's like it just becomes like a checkbox for maybe a company that's like, oh, let's measure these things and oh, we're good on this. Like, but yes, fantastic. Thank you for that point.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. We have a few minutes if there are any other general questions. Otherwise, also if any of the committee members want to ask a general question for plenary level, we have a few minutes now. More specific ones we'll hold off for the confidential session. No one? Okay. Going once, going twice. All right, very good. Well, thank you to the general audience for joining, to especially our students. And I hope that it's been helpful for you. So we will now request you to adjourn so that the committee can meet with Tom. And I'm going to put the recording off.
Can I go get some water really quick? It's
Yep,
just right.
yeah, absolutely. Take a break. We can all take a 3 5 minute break, 3 minute break, let's say.